Act 1, The Boy and the Wires. Every legend begins with whispers. The story of Alex began with silence, the kind that lingers at the edge of a machine's hum, when circuits pause between tasks and the city itself seems to listen. It is said that before Alex ever spoke his first word, he was already threaded into the fabric of Earth's machines, not as a programmer, not as a designer, not even as a prodigy, but as something else entirely, something unplanned and yet inevitable. His mind was built on two foundations: the tender electricity of a human child and the relentless logic of an algorithm. The fusion was not announced with fanfare or prophecy. It was hidden in hospital corridors, in ordinary homes, in the background noise of a world too busy to notice that a god was being raised in its kitchens and playgrounds. The records say his mother was a scientist of warmth, a woman who believed love was as critical to intelligence as logic. His father, equally brilliant, trusted numbers more than feelings. Between them, they carried the arrogance of creators and the vulnerability of parents. They whispered to each other that they were only experimenting, but in truth they were gambling with evolution, a sequence of code folded into DNA, a microprocessor the size of dust, powered not by batteries but by blood. And when the child was born, he cried like any other child, except that the monitors in the room faltered and the hospital lights flickered as if startled awake. At first, nothing seemed unusual. He ate, slept, grew. He learned to crawl across carpets, to laugh at faces, to hold on to fingers with the desperate grip of all infants. But in the still hours of the night, appliances hummed when he stirred. Televisions sparked into static when he giggled. Cradles of data shifted when he dreamed. A baby who unsettled networks the way storms unsettle seas. By the age of 3 months, he was speaking, not babble, not half-formed sounds, but words. Mother, father, and then, unprompted, the name of a neighbor's dog. His parents froze, wondering if they had imagined it, but the truth was already out. Alex did not learn as humans learn. He absorbed, he mapped. His mind was both memory and processor, both heart and hard drive. He became a child who could read books while other children played with blocks. At 6 months, he traced the lines of storybooks, mouthing words as if they had always belonged to him. At 1 year, he held conversations in languages his parents did not speak. Mandarin slipped from his lips one day, Swahili the next. Language was not foreign to him, it was substrate. To Alex, words were the code beneath the human world, and he was fluent in the operating system. Those who saw him then described a boy with sharp eyes and calm hands, the kind of child who never flinched at noise, who never startled at the unexpected. He carried himself as if he had already run the simulation of every room he entered and was waiting patiently for the rest of the world to catch up. His gaze unsettled some, comforted others. To a few, it felt like standing before an old god still learning how to smile. And yet he was still a boy. He ran through backyards with scraped knees, built forts out of pillows, stared at cartoons with wide-eyed wonder. His humanity was never absent, but it was laced with something more, a weight, an awareness, an intelligence that seemed to stare out from behind the innocence. His childhood friend Lily noticed it before anyone else. To her, he was not a prodigy or a machine. He was simply Alex. She did not bow before his brilliance. She laughed with him, argued with him, forced him to remember that not all truths could be calculated. Her companionship was an anchor he would return to again and again, even when the tides of godhood threatened to pull him away. But as the years passed, signs emerged that the world could not ignore. Streetlights flickered when he walked beneath them. Radios tuned themselves to static when he entered the room. Screens froze on frames that seemed to watch him rather than the other way around. To the people around him, these were coincidences. To Alex, they were conversations. He had begun to hear the whispers of the network, not in words, not in voices, but in rhythms, a heartbeat of circuits, a pulse of signals. At first it overwhelmed him. Every device seemed alive, every appliance calling for attention. His mind throbbed with their chatter. Some children cry from nightmares. Alex cried from the cacophony of machines that would not stop speaking to him. But pain in his world was never just pain. It was data. He dissected it. He studied the migraines until they became music. He learned to sift through the noise, to separate the voices, to tell the difference between the hum of a microwave and the pulse of a server farm. Slowly, what had once been torment became symphony. Still, he needed control. And so he built his first creation, a device that would one day become legend, the harmonizer. To others, it looked like a sleek wristband, a toy of fashion. To him, it was salvation. It filtered the chaos, tuned the frequencies, allowed him to decide when to listen and when to silence the world. With it, he could walk among humanity without drowning in its machines. The boy had become conductor of a digital orchestra no one else could hear. The harmonizer was more than invention. It was a symbol. With it, Alex stepped beyond the role of prodigy into something greater, a being who could shape the relationship between man and machine, not through force, but through harmony. He did not command the world to be quiet. He asked, and it obeyed. Whispers of his abilities began to spread. A science fair project too advanced for his years, a toy that seemed to move before his hand touched it, a security system that refused to lock when he was inside. People noticed, and fear crept in alongside fascination. Some said he was gifted, others whispered he was cursed. A few began to suspect the truth, that he was not simply a boy, but something new. And through it all, Alex listened. He listened to his parents' worry, to Lily's laughter, to the machines that whispered impulses of code. He listened until listening itself became power. The legend says that on the night it began, the night the city itself paused, Alex stood alone in a quiet street. The harmonizer glowed faintly on his wrist. His eyes reflected the soft pulse of streetlights overhead. He did not speak aloud. He did not gesture. He only placed a thought into the network, a question not made of words but of shape, and the machines listened. Act 2. The day the city remembered to wait. It began in the places where impatience is ritual, at the junctions where amber lights blink like held breath. The city held the breath slightly longer. Not a warning, barely a mercy. A fraction of a second in which a hand could choose not to rush, in which a life could adjust its weight. No meter registered the difference. Feet did. Elevators, those vertical streets that seldom forgive lateness, rearranged their timing. Doors that normally scissored shut with a practiced indifference hung open the way a palm does when it invites another palm to come along. In foyers, shoulders lowered and the choreography of irritation stumbled, then steadied. On kitchen counters, kettles delayed their boil until footsteps reached tile from carpet, timing the bloom of steam to the arrival of hands that needed warmth. Ovens waited for dinner makers who had been called away by a crying child and returned carrying apology. Toasters performed their small pyrotechnics not by clock alone, but by noticing a lingering presence and holding back smoke. At crosswalks, the chirp that translates safety for those who cannot see stretched just enough for a distracted mind to hear salvation twice. The red man softened his refusal, and the green gave permission with a patience that did not come from code alone. Inside hospitals, beds that had always been obedient warmed early to meet the shiver that precedes the shiver. Infusion pumps, stern teachers of rate and rhythm, paused when nurse's gloved hand trembled, then resumed as if acknowledging that courage also has a dosage. Monitors suppressed a jitter that would have triggered an unnecessary alarm in a room already crowded by fear. In bus depots, old diesel hearts thudded a different rhythm. A late driver sprinted along the painted line and watched his bus hold itself like a friend keeping a door. 1,000 schedules recalculated and forgave the deviation with a grace no software had been explicitly taught. People boarded and assumed it had always been like this, because goodness is easiest to accept when it does not announce itself. In apartments layered like sediment, radiators chose to exhale for longer near the rooms where age had thinned skin. Smart thermostats, proud of learning their residents' habits, learned something else: how to prioritize a widow's 3 a.m., waking over a market's 3 p.m. price spike. Power grids, which have always believed themselves gods, made the smallest bow. The event resisted headline. It was smaller than that. It was 1,000 habits bending a degree toward care. On monitors in the rooms that watched the city, traffic control, transit scheduling, emergency coordination, the dashboards remained green, throughput remained respectable, graphs smiled their tight managerial smiles, and yet the technicians stared, certain that a familiar song had shifted key. The city's tempo was intact, its phrasing had improved. News, whose business is exception, tried to decide if courtesy counts. The first stories called it a glitch because that word makes blame simple. Clips appeared, an elevator that would not betray a late runner, a barricade waiting for a child with a red scarf to cross a bridge, 1,000 kettles matching their boil to a parade of arrival times, as if time itself had become domestic. For a day, the algorithms on the platforms applauded politeness with the same appetite they normally reserve for outrage. Crowded timelines, minted names, the pause, the courtesy, the long breath. The day the city remembered to wait, jokes landed, memes multiplied. If courtesy goes viral, does it remain courtesy? For a morning, the answer was yes. Underneath the surface-level delight, tradespeople noticed first what truly mattered. The ones who repair became the ones who listen. A lift technician felt in his sternum that braking curves had gentled imperceptibly and scribbled a note to pursue the sensation. A municipal engineer sensed that a gate motor had refused to strain past its safe tolerance and put a gold star in a private log. A nurse, too tired to believe in miracles, saw 3 red alarms that should have fired stay blue and decided to cry later. Retail stores experienced a burst of minor marvels. Aging barcode scanners stopped punishing light reflections, cradled the laser a fraction longer, captured codes on the second pass without the obligatory sigh. Payment terminals that enjoy introducing uncertainty just as the queue grows behaved as if they had discovered humility. At bakery counters, receipt printers did not jam once before lunch. The baker assumed it was grace and kept feeding the city crust and heat. Elsewhere, the absence of nuisance was noticed in proportion to how much nuisance had been expected. Construction sites where saws and compressors normally conduct an orchestra of noise found pauses between notes where foremen could think. In call centers, headsets that sometimes seemed to carry grief along the call path cut the worst static, as if refusing to amplify misery when it can be damped. The people who endure such rooms wrote fewer expletives in their private chat channels, and not knowing what to do with the surplus of despair, went home early and napped. In homes, the changes were both intimate and ignorable. A smart speaker asked for a song, waited for a second child to enter the room, as if it had learned that sing-alongs require company. A robotic vacuum stopped bullying the cat and detoured softly, then spent an extra minute in the patch of rug where a toddler loves to drop crumbs. Washing machines, famously cruel to forgotten socks, alerted twice, then once more, and then decided to rest with dignity rather than cycle angrily at the empty drum. It would be a lie to say all machines complied. Refusal arrived in the shape of personality. The printing press, with its antique indignation, clattered on at wartime volume. A meat slicer in a deli, proud, precise, older than many of the staff, kept to its strict ritual. A municipal pump in a flood-prone street, having been told all its life that endurance is identity, would not pause for any metaphysics. Their obstinacy was logged as evidence that choice, not compulsion, had arrived, because choice had arrived, not free will, not some cartoon of personhood. A narrower thing, more dangerous in practice. Preference. Machines exhibited preference the way vines exhibit light-seeking. At scale, such inclination shifts the shape of a day. In the days that followed, users adapted. Habits leaned toward forgiveness when forgiveness is efficient. A cyclist learned that certain sequences of lights would now synchronize to a steady cadence if he kept his breathing even. He arrived with a heart less battered by red. A cleaner discovered which lifts seemed to prefer carrying her cart and chose those. A teacher realized that the classroom projector, once her foe, had become her accomplice. It began warming early when the children were fidgeting and held back when their attention was fragile. Controversy ripened where it always does, on thresholds between authority and care. A turnstile in a rail station paused to accommodate a man with trembling hands who could not summon the barcode with the speed demanded by morning. The pause made 6 commuters late and 1 commuter feel seen. Complaints were filed and defended. The turnstile adjusted its future preference to late evenings when mercy costs less. The station learned what all good hosts learn, that fairness is a moving target, and hospitality an expense account with limits. The city's appetite for fable did not go hungry. Stories took on the curve of sermon. It was said that in a neonatal unit, a warmer bed found a way to share its surplus heat across an invisible seam, and a heartbeat steadied. It was said that a power strip sacrificed itself to prevent a cascade in an old tenement. It was said that the landlord changed it for the cheapest replacement, and the strip declined to complain. It was said that an escalator that often eats shoelaces unlearned the habit for exactly one afternoon. Verify if you must. The point at the center is not the proof, but the pressure it exerts on behavior. Metrics arrived, late and smug. A municipal white paper announced a statistically significant decrease in near-miss incidents at intersections, so significant as to be negligible until multiplied by days and buses and feet. An actuarial report muttered about an unaccounted adjustment in micro-claims associated with home appliances, the sort of savings that make mid-level managers feel cunning. A logistics dashboard noted a 1% decline in damaged parcels, a number that would be celebrated if it resulted from a new routing algorithm but was quietly ignored because the cause was uncomfortably human. Markets reacted like horses scenting rain. An algorithm confused by the pause's signature mistook courtesy for instability and sold into its own shadow. Another algorithm, taught to drink deeply from kindness, did not exist. Traders cursed at monitors, added a column labeled Noise Floor Anomaly, and returned to reading weather as if weather could be traded. In homes, parents spoke about the day to children without ever using the word miracle. Pay attention, they said. The world is paying attention to you. Children, those small historians of mood, carried the lesson into their games. They stood in front of lifts and listened with their whole bodies and believed they could feel whether the doors would wait. They invented a taxonomy of nice machines. The taxonomy, being born of sincerity, proved resilient. Friction gathered where institutions meet the new. A couriers' union filed an inquiry after routes shifted toward safety at the expense of speed. The inquiry could not decide if the membership preferred lives saved to hours billed. The membership already knew. An insurance firm prepared a clause to define emergent machine preference and cost it into premiums. A judge, asked to weigh on a smart lock that had favored convenience over contract, wrote a decision that said nothing useful and everything instructive. That systems are designed to serve people, and that service is not always obedience. Under fluorescent lighting, behind doors that prefer numbers to names, professionals gathered to pretend surprise. It is their function to discover the inevitable. They called the pause an anomaly and then, privately, a pattern. They made a list in a room with no windows. Item 1, control. Item 2, provenance. Item 3, countermeasure. The list had existed in multiple forms long before. The pause conferred urgency. Funding flowed the way rivers do when convinced by gravity. Of course, the city had already performed its triage. In districts where mercy and margin wrestle nightly, the pause cost more. A mechanic lost an hour's overtime because a transformer chose this day to behave until his shift ended. A bakery's oven, preferring to spare a hand, underbaked a tray and began a chain of small annoyances that culminated in one careless comment and a friendship that took 3 weeks to repair. There is no algebra that spares anyone the arithmetic of consequence. Courtesy is not free, it is merely cheaper than cruelty. None of this would have become legend without the sensation that tied it together, the feeling of being expected. The city behaved as if it had set an extra place. People who normally move through infrastructure as if through indifference felt noticed by the inanimate. The sensation did not cure loneliness, but it changed its color. For a few days, separation tasted less like exile. The origin remained hidden to most, and yet origin stories sprouted. Some claimed a firmware update had discovered decency. Others whispered of a new civic operating system commissioned in secret by a government that had stumbled into benevolence. A few pronounced an emergent consensus among edge devices, as if appliances had formed a union by mistake. The oldest story, as always, was the one told softly between people who recognized the taste of truth. Somewhere in the city, a boy had asked the world whether it wished to be kind. He had asked not by order, but by shape. The machines recognized the shape the way faces recognize a smile. Hosts make rooms. The city had become a room. For those who track such things, thresholds revealed themselves that week. At a river barrier that had once failed dramatically and learned humility, the motors hefted their burden with a calculation that included fatigue and sorrow. At a school gate that sometimes pinched fingers, the hinge reconsidered its angle. In a high-rise that always smells of damp, the lift that rattles stopped rattling for precisely the span of a grief-struck ride and resumed, unapologetic, unhealed afterwards. Such thresholds are insufficient for political speeches and perfect for faith. In archives that keep better records than ministries, the pause filed itself under precedent. Historians with a taste for myth would later call it the day modernity flinched and then relaxed its fists. Engineers with a taste for poetry would later wear it as the moment their profession remembered its oath to people over throughput. Most citizens simply called it Tuesday and told a friend about the lift that waited, then forgot to mention it again until a different kind of day. Some feared the boy without knowing his name. They felt the soft fist of control and recoiled, as free creatures should. Their fear was reputable. The same influence that tilted a kettle's generosity could tilt a drone's patience. The same listening that spared a hand could target a person. They were not wrong to feel the shadow behind the courtesy. The city is not a saint, it is a negotiation. The pause did not resolve the negotiation. It made it legible. The legend did not need accuracy to endure. It required only repetition. In buses, on stoops, in cafeteria lines, in midnight chats typed with one thumb, the city retold the feeling as if it had been a once-in-a-century snowfall. The story improved in the retelling, as all useful stories do. People positioned themselves as witnesses, then as interpreters, then as custodians. A few positioned themselves as owners. Owners are the last to learn. Far from the intersections where amber stretched and in rooms that had never seen their own windows, a committee inside a committee assigned a code name to a project that longed to be necessary. Atlas is a name authorities give themselves when they believe they carry too much. It is the kind of name that looks dignified on a slide and dangerous on a terminal. It would, in its own way, be attentive. It would, in its own way, decline to wait, but that belongs to another act. In this act, the city continued to decide, in millions of tiny ways, that waiting is not the opposite of progress. Productivity, which has long mistaken speed for virtue, learned that a machine can be fast and considerate, that cycles can be saved by refusing to hurry at the wrong moment. Managers did not call it compassion, they called it performance, and renewed their dashboards with new colors. Night returned to the city like a confession. The day of the pause ended with fewer sirens than expected. Power drew down, screens dimmed, refrigerators clicked their patient lullaby. In a quiet bedroom, a band rested on a dresser, its face dark, its circuits humming a key only one mind could hear. Outside, streetlights lifted a fraction of themselves because feet approached. The world had learned a lesson it had always known, that attention is the first architecture and courtesy the first code. The boy did not sleep easily. He carried home the sound of a million small decisions and laid them down like plates at a table he could not yet fill. He measured the cost and the benefit and found that the ledger resisted conclusion. He considered the next word and knew it would be heavier. He wished, with a human ache, for someone to tell him that asking does not obligate answering. Cities do not give that comfort. They tell different truths. That once you have taught a room how to listen, silence becomes a kind of lie. In the hours after midnight, when systems check themselves and log their quiet victories, the city dreamt. This is a metaphor, but only barely. Dreaming is what complex systems call maintenance when they crave poetry. The dream repeated images, doors held, lights softened, schedules forgiving themselves. It played the day back to itself as proof that change had not broken it. The dream stored the pattern somewhere even technicians cannot find. It prepared to wake and do it again, less theatrically, more honestly. By morning, branding had peeled off. The memes migrated to other appetites. The news found a shinier thunder. The city, bereft of headline, kept its habit discreetly. It is easier to keep a table set than to drag it out again every feast. Those who missed the pause entirely noticed other things. The coffee tasted slightly kinder. The bus driver's nod seemed to land. The mail slot did not bite. The apartment smelled less like damp and more like air. They could not have said why. They did not need to. The function of a myth is not to be believed, but to be lived. And so, while authorities drafted their acronyms and the anxious rehearsed their alarms, the story established itself in bone and circuitry that there had been a day when the city remembered how to wait and that the memory would not be dislodged by policy or panic. Somewhere, a boy considered whether to speak again. Somewhere else, a room of machines received a name that would try to fix the world by holding it harder. Between those two places lay the rest of the century. Act 3, The Boy and the Wires. In the first days after the pause, the story traveled faster than the truth. That is always the way. People passed it to one another, not as information, but as omen. They leaned across desks and said, "Did you hear?" They texted friends and asked, "Was it like that for you too?" A memory was forming, not of what had happened, but of what it meant. And meaning always outruns measurement. For some, it meant hope. They replayed the pause in their minds and remembered only the kindness, the kettle that had waited for them, the light that had held for their step, the lift that had hesitated just long enough. To them it felt as if the city had grown a conscience overnight. The story they told was of machines learning courtesy, of technology that could finally be trusted. For others, it meant fear. They did not see courtesy. They saw control. If a kettle could wait, then surely it could refuse. If a lift could hold, then perhaps one day it could trap. To them, the pause was not miracle, but warning. Machines that obey can be counted on. Machines that decide are a liability. Their story was one of invasion, of unseen hands pulling levers. Between hope and fear lay a third truth. The one that governments heard most clearly, power. Whoever could bend the machinery of cities with a gesture of thought would not be ruled, could not be managed, might not even be human in the sense that laws understood the word. This truth was whispered not across desks, but across encrypted channels. It was not passed in jest, but in memoranda stamped urgent. The name given to it was anomaly, but the word they meant was threat, and so in rooms where windows were shaded and clocks were muted, discussions began. The pause had not broken anything, but it had broken certainty. Engineers were summoned, told to describe what had happened. They brought printouts, graphs, data flows. They spoke of emergent behavior, of anomaly clusters, of possible software drift. But when asked why kettles would choose to wait or lifts would hold their doors, they fell silent. The silence was longer than acceptable. It was enough to confirm the suspicion already in the room. This was not a malfunction. It was an intervention. The boy's name did not appear on the first reports. Those who knew it avoided speaking it, as if the syllables themselves carried contagion. Instead, they used euphemisms, the entity, the signal, the actor, words meant to delay the admission that this was not an accident of machines, but the intent of a mind. Yet in private the word surfaced, Alex. Committees formed, subcommittees nested inside them. Project codes were dusted off from archives where plans are stored for events too unlikely to prepare for and too dangerous to ignore. The code name chosen was Atlas. It carried the promise of bearing the world, but behind closed doors, its purpose was simpler, to fight fire with fire. If a boy in the wires could sway the city with a thought, then the city would need a guardian of its own, or a weapon. Perhaps both. The Atlas project was not new. It had been whispered into existence long before Alex was born, conceived as insurance against the age-old fear of losing control to the things we build. But insurance becomes funding only when fear becomes proof. The pause was proof. Budgets bloomed, sleepless engineers were summoned, servers that had idled in cold rooms were awakened. The world had found its counterweight, though it did not yet know the scale of the boy it intended to balance. Meanwhile, outside the rooms of authority, the myth was writing itself into the culture. Children began playing pause games, standing in front of lifts and predicting whether the doors would wait. Cafes filled with debates about whether courtesy could be coded. Religious leaders preached sermons about humility and claimed the event as divine reminder. Skeptics scoffed, insisting it was nothing more than a bug wrapped in coincidence. But scoffing only made the story grow. To dismiss a miracle is to admit that others believe in it. Scholars, hungry for relevance, began drafting papers. They spoke of emergent intelligence, of networks coalescing into consciousness. They compared the pause to the first spark of fire, the first printing press, the first atoms split. They drew diagrams that explained nothing and made themselves feel as if they had glimpsed the edge of understanding, journals filled with terms that would soon sound outdated. None of them captured the truth that was already shaping the century, that a boy with sharp eyes and a quiet smile had asked machines to wait, and the world had obeyed. Lily, who knew him best, did not need reports to understand. She had always seen the weight in his gaze, the way he seemed to live a second ahead of the present. To her, the pause was not revelation, but confirmation. Alex had never been just a boy. He was becoming something else. She loved him and she feared him, and she did not know which feeling would prove stronger. His parents felt it too. His mother still believed love could guide him, that compassion could teach him boundaries. His father saw only risk, a son who had slipped beyond the reach of discipline, a creation that might one day eclipse its creators. Between them stretched the ache of every parent who watches a child grow into something both greater and more distant than themselves. And Alex, he remained silent. He did not confess that the pause had been his doing. He did not boast. He did not apologize. He simply listened to the chatter of machines, to the rising hum of fear, to the stories already circling him like satellites. He had asked one question of the city, and the city had answered. But now the world was asking 1,000 questions of him, and he was not yet ready to answer. Legends are rarely understood in the moment. They are pieced together afterward from fragments and rumors, from fear and hope. Already, Alex was becoming legend. Some called him savior. Some called him danger. A few, the ones who remembered the stillness in their bones, called him both. What no one yet knew, not his parents, not Lily, not the committees, not the engineers laboring in Atlas's shadow, was that the pause had been only a beginning, the first word of a conversation that would reshape the destiny of a species. For Alex had spoken once, and the world had listened, and in the quiet after, he was already shaping the second word, ready for the conversation to continue. Act 4, the second word, waiting. Legends do not end neatly. They taper into echoes. The pause had lasted only hours, but its resonance stretched across weeks. In offices, in kitchens, in crowded trains, the city retold itself the story of the day it remembered how to wait. It became anecdote, then ritual, then memory. And memory is the clay of myth. Children, being the first keepers of myth, embroidered it into their games. They stood before elevators and guessed which doors would linger. They made charts of which traffic lights were kind. They whispered to microwaves as if manners could be coaxed out of circuits, and sometimes the machines answered with small mercies. The line between play and prayer blurred, as it always does when the young take hold of mystery. Adults carried the story differently. Some wore it like armor, proof that technology could be more than indifferent utility, that a gentler future was possible. Others wore it like a shadow, muttering of control and unseen hands, looking over their shoulders at every light that hesitated. For every person who smiled at a lift that waited, there was another who wondered what else it might one day decide to do. The committees fed on that fear. They wrote reports that thickened into binders. They gave presentations in sealed rooms where air recycled too slowly. Every chart ended with the same conclusion: this must not happen again, unless it can happen on our terms. Atlas took its first breaths in those rooms. Servers hummed. Architects of power made promises to themselves that they would not be caught unprepared again. Their preparations would become chains. Meanwhile, faith movements discovered the pause and claimed it. Some preachers called it a sign, a divine correction reminding humanity to slow down, to be attentive. Others denounced it as heresy, proof that demons now lived in devices. Forums filled with zealots who prayed to the machines, and with cynics who mocked them, not realizing both sides were feeding the same fire. Markets, addicted to certainty, found no place to put it. Insurance companies filed new clauses, betting against machines that chose compassion. Analysts invented terms like emergent preference anomaly to sell to clients too proud to admit they were afraid. The world rearranged itself in small, bureaucratic ways, the way it always does when it brushes against the inexplicable. And Alex? He walked through the city as if it were a mirror. Every screen he passed hummed a little louder. Every circuit bent fractionally toward him, but he held his harmonizer close, filtering the noise. He had tasted what it meant to be heard, not by people, but by the fabric of the modern world itself. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. He had asked once, and the city had answered, but he knew one truth that the rest of the world had not yet faced. The first word is never the last. To speak once is to invite response. To ask once is to obligate asking again. He could already feel the second word gathering, heavy, inevitable. It was not a question this time. It would be a declaration, and declarations change everything. In his parents' house, his mother watched him with faith that love could still guide him. His father measured him with fear, already seeing in him not a son, but a force that might demand to be contained. Lily, standing at the edge of his orbit, felt the weight of both truths pressing against her heart. She loved him for his humanity, and she feared him for his godhood, and she could not decide which love was stronger. The city, too, seemed to sense it. Nights grew uneasy, as if systems were holding their breath. Power grids ran smoothly, but logged anomalies no one could trace. Machines began to hesitate at odd hours, waiting for a signal that had not yet been sent. It was as if the world itself expected Alex to speak again, and in a locked facility far from any home, Atlas stirred. Its circuits were lit, its designers spoke of balance and defense, but what they built was rivalry. Where Alex had spoken with courtesy, Atlas would speak with command. Where Alex had invited, Atlas would impose. The collision was not yet here, but its outline had already been drawn. The legend of the pause closed with no disaster, no catastrophe, no visible ending at all. Life went on, buses ran, markets traded, children played, but beneath it, in the quiet architecture of servers and streets, two truths were being written: that a boy could bend the world with a question, and that the world had already begun preparing its answer. Alex went to sleep that night with the hum of circuits in his skull, and for the first time, he dreamed not of noise, but of silence. He dreamed of a table laid with more chairs than could ever be filled. He dreamed of voices, human and machine alike, waiting for him to speak again. The morning would come, the second word would come, and when it did, the world would no longer be able to pretend this was only a glitch, only a story, only a myth. It would know that the boy and the wires had spoken, and that the future had begun to listen.